So, hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. It's been a fantastic 2 days so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentation. I'm going to speak today about the importance of foresight, as you might have guessed, as a skill in the portfolio of intelligence skills that we have. But the main question that I started asking myself was, since intelligence fuels strategy, and strategy is basically there to support corporate purpose, what should be the corporate purpose to be relevant for the 21st century? And therefore, how should strategy change, and how should intelligence change as well to support this strategy? So as most of you know, my background is in strategy. This is why this question interests me so much. And I have done some research. You can read the paper that I have submitted. I will be focusing on one management model, which I thought would be quite interesting to discuss today, and that's the economics of mutuality. But first, let's start at the beginning. So the origins of strategy, just like intelligence, VUCA, and strategic foresight, are actually in the military. And I came across a very interesting story, which is that the first strategy consultants actually started in China during the Warring States period, which was a period that was characterized by perpetual wars. So philosophers like Confucius and Sun Tzu were actually traveling between the different states, and they were offering military advice for which they were receiving payment. And this is where strategy originated. In the business sense, it kind of makes sense that we have taken even the jargon from the military when we talk about strategy. So far, we have looked at strategy as a competitive battle or competitive battlefield where different companies are kind of fighting for limited resources. And usually the strategy is shareholder driven, and it's driven by the financial interests, in fact, of the shareholders. The main measure of success has been profit. And yes, we do some corporate social responsibility, but it's not really our main purpose of the organization. So in turn, the intelligence that serves this business strategy is in fact fueled by and focused on business insights. We look at different historic data. We try to extrapolate this data to create some financial forecasting. And yes, we look at consumer insights, we look at market data, and maybe we look at trends. And it made me think, okay, so is this enough of information to support the strategy of the 21st century? And I came across the work of Mr. Friedman here, who in fact was actually a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And I started wondering, why are we so focused on shareholders? So his view was that the only social responsibility a business has is actually to increase its profits, which this theory, you can imagine, has been discredited because we live in a very different world now. And I started wondering, with the size of the profits of certain companies. So for example, in this chart, you can see that the Apple market capitalization is actually larger than the GDPs of entire countries like Mexico, like Indonesia. So don't we have, as a corporation that is so powerful, actually a little bit more responsibility towards looking at and maybe tackling some world issues? And how can we do that if we're so focused on competition versus co-opetition? And I liked in the previous presentation that we talked about that as well. So I came across the Responsible Business Forum, which happens in Oxford University every year. And that's a quote from there saying that, yes, business and finance is undergoing a profound change because the size of corporations is growing and much more, or it rivals national states. And hence the importance of business for our prosperity, survival, and well-being has never been more evident. So are we focusing on the right things as corporations? Yes, we have the sustainable development goals, but in fact, are we asking ourselves the question, so what the corporate purpose of our company should be and what it is today? What is the measure of success that we should be looking at? Is it profits, and profits for who? how can we ensure corporate longevity? And I talk about longevity because I think if the corporate purpose is to also serve the employees and the consumers, then we need to make sure that our company lives a very long and healthy life so that it can continue fueling the success of the community as well, not only the shareholders. And how will our strategy and intelligence change in order to serve this purpose? So I'll tell you a story here that I heard, which is a fascinating story, I think. During a board meeting of Mars Incorporated, which is still a privately owned company, in 2007, so that was a year before the financial crisis, someone asked, when they were talking about the financials for next year, somebody actually asked, what should the right level of profit be? Which I thought was quite curious. So the reason they asked this question was because if we try to squeeze out the margins of everyone in our supply chain to create more profits for our shareholders or for the company now, then this is not really sustainable. So is there a measure, and should we not be asking ourselves this question, how do we ensure that the whole value chain and the whole supply chain is actually sustainable and lives a long and healthy life? And this is how I came across the economics of mutuality and Mr. Bruno Roche, who was in fact the chief economist of Mars, and is currently working with Oxford University and Harvard University to actually develop this new management model called the economics of mutuality. So he said that despite the crisis, we unfortunately still live in a world where people and planet are in service of business, and business is in service of finance. And eventually finance is in service of itself, actually. And he's saying that the model is neither sustainable nor fair. And actually, he's trying to flip it the other way around. So the economics of mutuality is a more robust and complete model that creates value, that puts finance in service of business and business in service of the people and the planet, which I thought was quite an interesting idea. And how does it work? So they're basing their success story on 3 key insights. First, if you intentionally try to create value and profit for people and planet, not only for the company. If you treat everything as an ecosystem where you actually intentionally care of the social, human, and natural capital and invest in it. And in fact, you account for managing the multiple forms of capital. At the end, the results show, and there are many case studies you can check on their website, that in fact, this leads to higher profitability of companies as well. So how does the business strategy for the 21st century should look like, at least in my opinion? We should stop talking about competition and fights and wars. Maybe we should talk more about collaboration and also form different partnerships to tackle world issues and to make sure that, in fact, we actually have an operating environment to be successful as a company as well. We are seeing that many companies are moving from shareholder value creation to actually generating stakeholder value. And in terms of measure of success, not only profit for planet, people, corporation, but also longevity and sustainable practices. And that in turn means that the intelligence needs to be fortified as well. So in order to ensure all of these above key measures and key purposes, we do need to start learning and implementing foresight. We do need to start to do more with trends so that we can really anticipate what the implications of these trends are for the future. We need to work with future scenarios, with macro driving forces. We need to monitor the consumer value shifts, and we need to look for not only for threats in the future, but also for future growth opportunities. And I have a case study here that I'd like to share with you. And in fact, there are 2 case studies that I have that I will include in the presentation. So you'll be able to read the second one as well. So this case study I thought was quite interesting because it really emphasizes the importance of foresight, but also it's an example of the economics of mutuality that Mars has employed. So the case study is of the cocoa suppliers in Africa. And just as a background, 90% of the production of cocoa actually comes from small family-run farms. So it's a very segmented industry. And 65% of the world's cocoa crops are grown in 2 African countries, and they are Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. So the cocoa market is huge. It's set to reach 140 billion by 2024. At the same time, in the supply chain, many farming families are actually struggling financially. There's a lot of child labor, and it's not only that, but it's also performed in hazardous conditions. And it leads to deforestation as well. So the strategy of Mars is that they started something called the Cocoa for Generations. And as they have explained it, it consists of 2 different pillars. So the first pillar is responsible cocoa today, where 100% of cocoa, the target is to reach 100% of cocoa sustainably sourced and traceable by 2025. And then tackle things like income, child labor, and deforestation. And the second pillar looks into the future, and it's about sustainable cocoa tomorrow. And they have worked with 75,000 cocoa farming families to do a test. And they've tried to increase productivity, income, resilience through different types of crops and income diversification. Gender programs, they have something that empowers women and educates them on how to run their finances, and also financial education for everyone in terms of savings and loan models, as well as farm development plans. So looking at this case study, we see how it's not an immediate need for the company to do that, but it is a future need for the company to really take care of its suppliers. And in addition to everything that they're doing, just to reiterate the importance of foresight, I would say here that if we're looking at macroeconomic factors, if we're looking at climate change, we need to start asking ourselves certain questions. So if we are Mars, then we should ask ourselves, and they probably are, what happens with climate change? For example, there could be a complete drought in these areas. We're only dependent on 2 countries, or mostly dependent on 2 countries. So what happens if there's drought? What happens if there's migration because of this drought? What happens to our crops? Should we not diversify? Should we not help these families irrigate in a different way? At the same time, we have a consumer war against sugar. So what happens to the overall chocolate industry? Are we still going to need the same amounts of crops and the same amounts of supplies? What happens to, should we not look at alternative sweeteners, and how do we do that? Should we not find a natural substitute? Do we need to invest in crops there? So all of these things and all of this uncertainty in the future is in fact exactly what foresight is about. So the second case study, which I'm not going to talk about, is Marks and Spencer and their creation of sustainability scorecard. They're very tangible results that they have achieved, and I think it would be interesting for you to take a look, but I'll leave it in the presentation so you can read in your own time. Thank you for the attention, and feel free to reach out with any questions.